Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special event presented to you by Word Vancouver in collaboration with Banyan Books and Sound. My name is Ross McKeechee, and I'm the host of the Banyan Books podcast. This evening, we are joined by Professor Benjamin Perrin and Dr. Gabor Maté. Dr. Gabor Maté is an internationally renowned speaker, highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. Rather than offering quick fix solutions to these complex issues, Dr. Maté weaves together scientific research, case histories, and his own insights and experience to present a broad perspective that enlightens and empowers people to promote their own healing and that of those around them. After 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, Dr. Maté worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. Gabor is the co-developer of a therapeutic approach, compassionate inquiry, now studied by hundreds of therapists, physicians, counselors, and others internationally. He is the best-selling author of 4 books published in over 25 languages. His book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, received the Hubert Evans Prize for Literary Nonfiction. His other books include When the Body Says No, Scattered Minds, and with Dr. Gordon Neufeld, Hold On to Your Kids. And as he mentioned to us just before we started, he's currently finishing his next book, which is titled The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture, that should be out in May 2022, I believe he said. For his groundbreaking medical work and writing, he has been awarded the Order of Canada, as well as the Civic Merit Award from his hometown, Vancouver. For more on his books and programs, go to his website, drgabormate.com. That's drgabormate.com. Professor Benjamin Perrin. Benjamin Perrin is an author and professor at the University of British Columbia, the Peter A. Allard School of Law, where he researches and teaches in the areas of criminal and international law. He joined UBC in 2007 after serving as a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada and advising judges at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Special Court for Sierra Leone. He was also the lead justice and public safety advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada from 2012 to 13. Professor Perrin was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in recognition of his significant contributions to Canada. In recent years, our distinguished guest was confronted with childhood and intergenerational trauma, addiction, mental health challenges, and disability in the lives of people close to him and his own. In this journey, he found freedom and peace in Jesus Christ. He is an advocate for compassionate, evidence-based approaches to pressing criminal justice and societal issues. Professor Perrin is the author of policy papers, journal articles, and several books, including Invisible Chains, Canada's Underground World of Human Trafficking, which was a national bestseller and named one of the top books of the year by the Globe and Mail, as well as Victim Law, the law of victims of crime in Canada. And today we're in conversation about his latest book, which is titled Overdose, Heartbreak and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis. It has been shortlisted for numerous 2021 awards, including 2 Hubert Evans Prizes for nonfiction. Everybody, please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Gabor Maté and Professor Benjamin Perrin. Both of you, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us on. It's a pleasure.
So to start with, Ben, I'd like to ask you a question about how the book came to be. So you were the lead justice and public safety advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper from 2012 to 13, an administration that's notorious for being tough on drug use and for trying to shut down harm reduction and safe injection projects like Insight. So can you tell us the story of what inspired you to question that kind of prohibitionist policy and how you came to write this very illuminating book on the reality of the opioid crisis in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, that's the place to start. I look back at my views on drug use and drug policy, and as I described in the book, I came to understand they were just a real deadly mix of ignorance and ideology. Right? I very simplistically, like still many Canadians believe wrongly that drugs are bad, and so we should criminalize, not only criminalize them but anything related to them, and we should not do anything to enable them and their use because they cause harm. Right? This idea that if something's harmful, you should suppress it. That's literally as far as the logic went in my head, and still goes for many, I'll say, conservative politicians. And so when I went to Ottawa, I took a year off of my job as the law prof and was Prime Minister Harper's top criminal justice advisor. At that point, the efforts to shut down Insight, the supervised injection site here in Vancouver, had been taken up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Harper government had lost that battle. They tried to shut down programs to provide a safe supply for people who were using street drugs. They had already increased mandatory minimum penalties dramatically. So the chairs were already set, as it were, around the table. And my regret now, knowing what I know, is that I didn't speak up on this issue. I accepted that ideology, the party, blindly, and that it scares me. Quite honestly, it scares me that I did that, because people who know some of my political background, it's very public, didn't hesitate to speak up on other issues. So this is one that I didn't, and I've actually apologized for that, and it's one of the things I'll bring to my grave, really, that I regret. And so the journey for me started, after I left actually that position, and back at, you drive into UBC every day to teach criminal law. And I started hearing, this is around 2013, 14, 15, story after story in the media of people overdosing and dying. Back then, if you can believe it, this doesn't happen now, the media would report on individuals who were overdosing and dying. You would actually hear their names. You would hear a bit of their story. And that doesn't happen now. It's all just statistics and numbers once a month, if you ever see those stories anymore. And it started to concern me. It was very obvious that something big was going on. And then when the province declared a public health emergency for the opioid crisis in 2016, that's when it just kind of hit me. And I pulled my car over, and it was 2 thoughts I had. One was, why didn't it bother me more that people were dying in our community? That these people who I didn't even know, I didn't have someone close to me who'd overdosed and died. A lot of people assume that must have been the changing point. But it bothered me that I didn't care. It also bothered me on a deep level that I had been part of a government that had not only continued, but dramatically amped up the war on drugs. And it was obvious to me that wasn't working, and was probably a big part of the problem. So as I pulled the car over, at this point in my life, I was starting to, I think, as maybe we'll talk about, my own personal life was also starting to reveal cracks through it, and things that I had never processed from my, when I was younger, ways that I'd started to cope with those pains and traumas starting to catch up with me. They weren't working anymore. And I had started turning back to my faith that I had as a child, but had never carried really through and hadn't grown. And it was something that I had was not a big part of my life. And so that was the start of it. As I pulled over the car and made a very simple prayer. I asked God to just give me a heart of compassion for people who were dying. And at that point, things took off very quickly. I started contacting people in the law faculty. I said, is anyone working on the opioid crisis in this area? Is anyone doing work on this in the criminal justice sphere? Crickets. Went on Twitter, I asked, because I was connected with law profs across the country, is there any criminal law professor in Canada doing any work on this? Nothing, which is incredible. It's astounding. It's at that point, it was already a national crisis. And yet not a single Canadian legal academic in the criminal justice sphere was researching it, was talking about it, was looking at it in any way. And so that for me was the start of this project. I began very quickly trying to raise some funds. I didn't want to wait for 2 years to apply for a grant and then start the project, and was fortunate to get a small amount of money together to hire a research team, to begin traveling around the province. And the core idea that I had was that I had to go in with an open mind and an open heart and be completely prepared to revisit and challenge everything I thought I knew. And I was going to do that by reading the research, but more importantly for me was meeting the people affected. And I wanted to talk to everyone who had been affected that I could think of. Everyone from obviously people who were using drugs, their family members. I also wanted to talk to the prosecutors who were prosecuting people and the defense lawyers. What did they think about this? What about the judges who sit in these courtrooms and sentence people who have substance use disorders? What about the border guards who are supposedly, catching the fentanyl at the border? What about Indigenous communities and leaders? What about addictions specialists and experts? And the list went on. And it was a real journey for me, and it was a process. And that's what I've tried to chronicle in Overdose, because I hope that people who, like me, were opposed or reticent or maybe just unsure about some of the things we're going to talk about today, like decriminalizing drugs, all drugs, like providing a safe supply, like more holistic responses, that it could be a part of helping changing their hearts and their minds too, if I could help them come on this same journey. I also hope that it would have some impact politically, and we could talk about that more, but that was the real genesis of this project.
Wonderful. Thank you. Really a transformative journey for you. And Gabor, I know for yourself, we're kind of just getting to know each other at the beginning here. So for our audience that might not know, you're widely regarded as one of the world's leading experts in understanding and treating trauma, as well as addiction. Can you share a bit with us about your story, as how you went from a practicing family medicine to now traveling the world and speaking and teaching on these topics?
Thanks, already. And first of all, I just had to say how glad I was to see Benjamin's book come out, because of where he had been coming from. I mean, he talked about, he used to believe that anything harmful should be suppressed. And if that was the case, we should have been suppressing the Conservative Party a long time ago, because the Conservative Party, in the policies it was pursuing, was actually killing people. And before Benjamin joined the governmental office, which is I think 2012, but before then, when the Harper government was pursuing the policy or the legal battle of shutting down Insight, where I used to work, where I was working at the time, I met with a lawyer once for the government at actually a symposium at UBC at the law school, and I said to him, if you win this case, people are going to die, documentably. If you shut down this place, people are going to die. If my side wins the case, people are going to live. How do you feel about that? Now, he had no feeling about it whatsoever. So for someone then from Benjamin's background, who actually was part of that system and has come to a different understanding, it's very powerful for somebody like that to come out and speak the truth as he now understands it. And I'll have a question for you, Benjamin, afterwards. But to answer your question more directly, through my years of family practice, I really began to learn that many people's adult issues, whether mental health conditions or physical health conditions and addictions, really was related to childhood trauma. And when I already knew that by the time I came to work in the downtown east side, which was really a liberation for me because, you know, I'd done panic practice for 20 years and I wanted something different. And so when I got the phone call from the Portland Hotel, which I know Benjamin visited for his research for the book, and they said, how would you like to come in this grubby, rat-infested, cockroach-infested hotel? I thought, great, when do I start? And I felt right at home there. And partly I felt right at home because I really, the emotional energies and the pains and the emptiness of the people that were pursuing their drugs, I could relate to very much personally. So I didn't see myself as all that different from them. Now, when I began to write my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, I was simply going to write on life in the downtown east side. What I didn't realize is that nobody had ever written a book putting together childhood trauma, the life of the childhood histories of these people, the science of brain development, and some thoughts on drug policy into one book. And that's how my book came about. So I got educated down there, just like Benjamin got educated in his particular pursuit of the facts with his book. So for me, it was a natural transition, very much a personal one, but also a truly eye-opening one. And I'll just finish by saying that the Global Mail, some years ago, when I was still working in the downtown east side, sponsored a symposium, an intellectual symposium called How Do We Solve the Problem of the Downtown East Side? Something like that. And I thought, you silly people, there's no problem of the Vancouver or the downtown east side. There's the problem of Canada, which traumatizes our Indigenous people, which is why 30% of the people on the downtown east side are Indigenous, which is why 30% of the people in our jails are Indigenous people. There is the problem of Canada, where abused children don't get the proper help, but they get psychiatrically labeled or punished, but don't get the right help. And so, like Benjamin, I really began to look at the larger picture. And with that, I just wonder if I can ask you a question, Benjamin. Ben, so you came to this, you got back to your Christian roots, and that was your saving grace. Literally, that was your saving grace.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, the hyper-conservatives see themselves as Christians.
Yeah.
But they seem to be Christians who don't know anything about Jesus. Because what Jesus taught was that these are the people that you do embrace, and you don't punish them, and you love them, and you love them back into health. That was, if I understand, if as a good Jewish boy I understand Jesus' teachings, that's what this great man was teaching. Where's that split for them, where they're Christians, but they're not Christians? They're Christians without getting Christ. How did you deal with that, and how do you explain that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Gabor. I've brought my faith into this discussion, and whenever anyone wants to talk about it, I want to talk about it. The other reason is, 2/3 of Canadians identify as Christian, so we're not used to talking about faith in the public sphere, right? And yet it's clearly plays a role. So what I came to understand was that, I may have been a Christian, I was part of a religion, but I was not yet a follower of Jesus. I was not yet a disciple of his. I was not walking in his steps and following his teachings, and I had not yet had my heart changed and my life transformed by him. And those are two very different things. And so, yeah, part of my journey was realizing that I was what you might hear as a cultural Christian, an unsaved Christian, a Christian in name only. There's a very simple passage that I can answer you with from something Jesus himself said. He said, many people are going to come to him on the last day and say, Lord, Lord, didn't we cast out demons in your name? Didn't we heal people? Didn't we do this, that, and the other? And Jesus says, I will say I didn't know you. And it gets even more pointed than this. It says he's going to have one group of people on his left and one on his right. And one of the groups he's going to say, blessed are you because I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I was sick and you came.
Exactly.
And they are going to answer and say, Jesus, and their people are going to answer and say, when did we ever see you, Lord, naked or hungry or in prison? And he says, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. And then the flip side, of course, is the exact opposite. And so it's very clear. He taught it from his own words that there are many, many people who are in for a big surprise. And this is just, if you're a follower of Jesus, those are warnings that are in the Bible for a reason. They're in there for a reason. And, whoever has ears, let them hear. That's how Jesus ended almost every parable, right? So, yeah, I thought it was really important to speak as part of this to Christians. And what I've said, I've been invited actually to speak at churches and at Christian conferences, as well as secular events too. But I've also made the point, there's two places, if Jesus were walking the earth physically today, that he'd be. One is he'd be in places like the downtown east side, healing and touching people and being close to people who are in trauma, who are in need, who are sinners, who are, and and the other places he'd be is he'd going to churches saying, you're a bunch of hypocrites. Most of you are a bunch of hypocrites, right?
If they let him.
Yeah, if they let him. And we know, kind of know how things went for him when he spoke truth the last time, right? So yeah, but for me, this church, it changed my heart. This is what gave me this heart of compassion. And I think it's important that we look at how do people come to really major sort of changes of view and changes of things that are so core. For me, really, politics was always supposed to be about helping people. And that's why I got involved. And I learned very quickly that politics is about the people who are in it trying to keep their jobs for the most part. And, with some exceptions, there are people I met who are in it for the right reasons, but most people are in there trying to keep their jobs. And many of them have never had an employability outside of politics either. It's a scary idea for them I don't think anyone would want to have to run for office to keep your job. I don't envy them, but it's a public service and they're supposed to be acting in the public interest. And we have premiers like in Alberta and Ontario right now who are whose policies on the opioid crisis are killing people, and they need to be called out. And we can talk more about politics, but to answer your question, yeah, I think it is a real hypocrisy that people would claim to follow someone who they say is a savior who was there touching lepers who no one would go near, who met with sinners and tax collectors, the people who are the most hated by society. And if we're claiming to be Jesus's followers, we need to be compassionate and caring and loving and understanding and non-judgmental, right? That's the other piece to this.
You say that over and over again in your book, Ben, that these people don't need our judgment and condemnation. They need our love, our compassion, our understanding. And I know, Gabor, you talk a lot about compassionate, curious inquiry. And I know compassionate inquiry is the modality that you've been working with people. I'd just like to, if we can, step back and give our audience an idea of just how serious this opioid crisis is in Canada and in North America. So I'm wondering if I can have you both comment on not only the data around it, but your own direct experiences with what's happening and who it's affecting. So maybe Ben and then Gabor can comment.
Absolutely. I mean, at the highest possible level, quite bluntly, this is a public health emergency that's been going on for a decade. It has never been declared a public health emergency at the national level. It has been in BC. Over 20,000 people have died in the last 5 years from the opioid crisis, and that's before the increase of opioid-related deaths during COVID. Where it really hit me, the magnitude of this crisis, was in two ways. One was charts and graphs showing that the number of people dying of illicit drug overdose in British Columbia eclipses all of the other causes of unnatural death combined. We're talking about suicide, homicides, car accidents, pharmaceutical overdoses. If you add all of those up,
or if I'm interrupt,
yeah, please,
or COVID.
That's right, and thank you. Yeah, and COVID, exactly. Vastly, we had 1 month, just 1 month in 2020 that eclipsed all of the COVID deaths for the entire year during this pandemic. And so that's the that's the first thing that really kind of I would mention in terms of the scale of what we're dealing with. The second thing is the much more personal, individual stories. These are not just about people dying. It's about, first of all, the tragedy. And I want to acknowledge here, there are a lot of people in this webinar tonight. And I know that there will be people here who have had loved ones, friends, and family members who have passed away. And yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that and recognize that. It's not something that I had experienced until after my book was published. And within 6 to 8 months after Overdose came out, there were 2 people who we knew who passed away from illicit drug overdose deaths. And they both, to your point, Gabor, both had significant childhood trauma that they were never able to get help for, right? And so there are broken lives, broken families, children who are being raised now without fathers and mothers. There are people who have suffered permanent brain damage from not being given oxygen after they overdosed. At one point, we talk a lot about hospital capacity in COVID. At one point, we found through access to information filings that the government never previously made public that there were discussions because of the overflow of hospital morgues and funeral homes of bringing in refrigerated trailers for people who had overdosed and died. This is the scale at which we're talking about here. More people have died of opioid-related overdose deaths than all of the post-World War II casualties, fatalities in Canadian military conflicts. I mean, it begs the question of why are we still at this stage? Why are we as a society not taking the steps that all of the evidence and research says needs to be taken? There's answers to those questions, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself.
What would you add to that, Gabor?
Well, I won't need to repeat the statistics, except to say a couple of things about the overall situation and then the personal impact. We are very keen, and governments are beating their breasts about how they're following the science on COVID. Well, Bonnie Henry, our wonderful provincial health officer, has made very clear statements about the opioid crisis and what needs to be done to reverse this terrible epidemic. The governments are not following the science. So they choose when and where to follow the science when it's politically convenient. Because the science is totally clear, as Ben demonstrates in his book, and certainly as I demonstrate in my book as well. And I was in Ottawa once at a Senate committee that was invited to go speak to a Senate committee that was considering a new criminal omnibus that would make things harsher. This was in the Harper days. So there was a conservative majority in the Senate committee. And I gave them all the science, all the evidence, all the studies, all the references. And as far as the conservative members were concerned, it wasn't that it went in one ear and came out the other. It never even went in one ear. Mm. And I finally said to them, look, senators, as a physician, I'm expected to practice evidence-based medicine. How about you practice evidence-based politics? But of course, words are meaningless. It's like those that have ears will hear. These people didn't have ears. On the personal level, here's what happens. Especially the people on the downtown east side, but addicted people in general, are the most traumatized people in society, amongst the most traumatized. Addiction is not the only outcome of trauma, but it's one of the major ones. And that's the one part in Benjamin's books where I didn't quite agree, because you seem to embrace the medical disease model of addiction, which I don't.
Yeah, we could talk about that. I wouldn't say.
Yeah, but
yeah.
I don't see addiction as a disease. I see it as a trauma response. Yeah, it's a coping mechanism, and I think you alluded.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And that means that the drug laws are taking the most abused, tormented children in our society when they become adolescents and adults, and then we punish them for having been abused. This is essentially what we're doing. So when you look at a place like the downtown East Side, you think you're looking at the depredations of drug addiction. No, you're not. You're looking at the depredations of the drug laws and the incomprehension with which this society treats those people. Because in my medical training, and I'm assured as well that in your legal training, did you ever hear a single lecture on trauma?
Well, I'll tell you what, the first one is, the first one's going to be tomorrow, Gabor. I'm teaching it in my class, but that's it. It's not taught.
I'm so glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm inviting myself to come and talk to your class sometime.
I would love that. I'm going to hold you to that. It's on recording.
But here's the thing. The average physician never hears a single lecture on trauma. The average lawyer never hears a single lecture on trauma. They'll hear it in your class, but it's not part of the curriculum, is it?
No, not at all. No.
You know,
It's the first year too.
And yet, virtually all the people that come in front of judges and lawyers in the criminal courts were traumatized people, and that's why they're there. And especially when it comes to drug use. And then, so what we're doing is we're tormenting these people. We're inflicting disease on them. We're inflicting death on them. We're ostracizing them. We're creating suffering upon suffering upon suffering. That's the personal cost. It's not just in the statistics. It's in the number of lives that we're immiserating by our refusal to follow the evidence. And as Benjamin so movingly puts it, by not following our hearts, by not opening our hearts.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Yeah, I can tell you just briefly on this. I realized, through this book about the role of trauma, and then started doing even more research and looking into broader, prison populations. And some of the recent work you've done has been really helpful for me in that too. I started following up on the Compassion Prison Project and those great people you introduced me to through your documentary there. And I basically reached the conclusion this summer while I was updating my first year criminal law course at UBC. There's 4 of us who teach different groups of 50 students. If I'm still alive teaching this course in another 20 years, there's going to be 1,000 lawyers who will go through my class, 1,000 more lawyers. And I told them on the first day of classes, just a week ago, I reached the point of it being I could not ethically teach them how to send people to jail or defend them, and if they did not understand the harms that are at stake and how much harm the system causes myriad groups of disenfranchised and marginalized people. So I basically scaled the course down to the bare bones of what's the black letter law they need to learn. They're going to learn that. I clerked at the Supreme Court of Canada. I assured them they're going to learn the law. They'll be fine. But they're also going to learn how it has been used in ways and how it has been constructed in ways that are devastating to Indigenous people, to Black people, to people who use substances, to people who are homeless, to gender diverse communities. It goes on. And so, we're entering into a place now where I thought students would be resistant to this and saying, well, just teach us the law. But I'm happy to tell you that this group of young people, they're born, just 22, 23-year-olds. They're expecting this now.
If they're anything like medical students, here's the deal with medical students. Studies have been done that the highest level of compassion exists when they first enter medical school. And then as they go through their training, the level of compassion dramatically drops. Now, so you're getting them just at the right time.
That's right.
When their minds and hearts are still open, before the weight of all the legalese, bureaucratic lingo just shuts, and all the stress on them just shuts their hearts, Yeah. So I'm really glad to hear what your initiative on this.
Well, we'll see how it goes. It has to happen because, I just, like I said, I think if we're producing functionaries, the system itself can't be changed from within by a well-meaning person. I mean, you both may know or not Harold Johnson's work. He's an former Indigenous Crown lawyer and defense lawyer, and his book it's called Peace and Good Government. My students are reading that as a required reading, and he has a whole chapter in his book, even as a Cree man, how he said the system, he didn't change the system changed him.
Yeah.
And so it's a call for Indigenous justice in Canada, right? And so that can't be achieved through tinkering with the system or simply sprinkling in the attendance of elders at parole board hearings, that we need to be looking at a fundamental rethink of the entire criminal justice system. And this is where we begin to really get into some important areas. And, you know, we talked about the role of faith in changing people's minds and hearts. The other one is money. That's another one. If you don't have that soft heart, you're not there. We can talk about the billions of dollars, let alone the lives that are destroyed through the criminal justice system today, and how much better outcomes you get when you support people, right, through treatment and recovery and addressing these underlying, you know, issues.
Here's where we get into a problem, because sometimes people say about the war on drugs being a failure, or let's say they talk about the war in Afghanistan being a failure. Well, from the point of view of stated purposes, both wars are absolute disasters. But out of the $2.1 trillion that the Americans spend on the Afghan war, 1.9 trillion went to big American corporations. It wasn't a failure for them whatsoever. It was a huge, major success. And then it's the same with the war on drugs. It is a success. So it's not just a question of, yes, as a society we'll save money, but some very powerful people will lose some perks. I mean, there is a powerful, particularly in the States, there's a powerful prison industrial complex. And in Canada, I mean, there's a lot of the legal system makes its living out of the suffering of traumatized people. So it's not, overall society loses, but some pretty powerful people win. And not to mention the politicians who can never lose votes by being tough on crime.
Yeah.
You know, so there's some huge stakes here.
That's right.
That people don't want to lose. So we're not just up against ignorance. We also talk up against interest.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think fear is a big driver, right? That's a big driver. And the fear of and stigma against people who use drugs, the fear of, you know, violence from someone who's different than you. This is what you see. So here's a good example. You mentioned that my work on victims of crime. One of the things that kind of astounded me when I got into the statistics around victims of crime, which is the other group of traumatized people in the criminal justice system as well. There's other groups too, like the people who work in it are often traumatized through this too. But in terms of victims, the single sort of least likely to experience a crime, and this is statistically speaking, are senior citizens. They're actually the most safe people in society, people over 65. And yet we saw
what a relief. Thank you.
and yet there were laws that were passed to protect seniors from crime, right? This is like focusing on victim. Now, why was that? Why was there not laws being passed to this date still to do more to protect those who are disproportionately victims of crime? Indigenous people, Black people, people of color, women, gender diverse people, disabled people, people who use substances. These are grossly disproportionately victimized by crime, and yet we don't see that. And so for me, looking at it through a kind of political lens, the answer is very obvious. It comes down to things like participation rates in elections. It comes down to things like donations to political parties. It comes down to things like privilege and power. And this is the dark underbelly of the way our democracy works, actually, right? It's not the case that there is an even equal level of value placed on people's lives or their decisions. And it doesn't surprise me to hear things like the last federal election had a massive decline in voting by Indigenous peoples. This is a colonial system that's been imposed on them. Promises keep getting made to Indigenous peoples about change coming, and then they don't see it. And yeah, that's another big part of this for me, is both in the incarceration, the victimization, the overdose deaths that we see, COVID. It is again this continued perpetuation of the same old tragic patterns of Indigenous people being massively overrepresented in each of these areas.
We're talking a lot about policy and government action, and it's top of mind that we have a federal election coming up in 5 days. I'm just wondering if either you care to comment on, is there any candidate that seems to be addressing this in the way that it needs to be addressed?
I personally haven't followed the election that closely, to tell you the truth. I have minimal interest in it because I don't think they lead to changes one way or the other. I mean, you have Tweedledum or Tweedledee, all the beautiful promises that Trudeau made about the indigenous rights. What has he kept? Nothing, I read this morning that finally there was some First Nations reservation that got potable drinking water after 20 or 30 years of having to drink out of bottles, So having said that, though, by and large, and again, I don't belong to any political party, but by and large, and Benjamin might tell me otherwise, from what I understand of the NDP approach, they seem to be a bit more open-minded about this situation. And that may be because they've never been in power, so they've never had to deal with the realities of keeping power. But I know within the Liberal Party, look, the former health minister, Jane Philpott, she'd read my book. She tweeted about it. She totally understood about trauma and addiction. And she was going to do something about it. So, and she talked to people in the Liberal Party. So I don't know too many people in the Conservative Party, but I know within the Liberal Party, there are people who know better, but they're not doing better. So I don't have a whole lot of faith in the electoral process to change things. And I have no idea. The NDP was not going to get into power. I don't know what they would do if they did, but they seem to be, I think, on the level of principle, at least more open to these conversations than the other parties are. And with conservatives, actually, they just don't know. I mean, I think they're just ignorant. I think they're willfully ignorant. I don't think they want to know. Benjamin is a great exception of somebody who actually wanted to know and he went to find out. But they don't want to know, and for all kinds of reasons. The Liberals, I think, are much more clever. I think they do know. And in that sense, they're more culpable because they know, but they still don't do anything. So who's more culpable? The one who doesn't know or the one who knows and doesn't do anything? So if that sounds cynical, so be it, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you said. It used to be surprising, but it's not anymore, unfortunately, to me, that issues like the opioid crisis just are not election issues. And it wasn't an election issue before COVID either, by the way. It's not like that's the issue. That's the reason I kept track of, CBC would have, it's like, here's the big issues of the day. And as I was doing my research, it wasn't even coming up for them. So it's just got to be, I mean, I can't even understand how devastating this would be for families who have lost loved ones. And it has affected different groups, as I said, disproportionately, but it has also affected all Canadians from all walks of life. One thing that I did notice in the current campaign, though, which I am feeling like a small amount of positivity towards, is the federal Conservatives finally, and by the way, I'm not a member of that party, and I'm not a member of any party right now. I've completely kind of walked away from politics, but I'm very interested in policy and how things are done in Canada. They announced that they are no longer going to, this is about 20 years after the Insight case. It's taken them that long to finally read the Supreme Court case and abide by what the court said. Basically, they're no longer going to oppose supervised consumption sites at the federal Conservatives. Well, that needs to get downloaded to the provincial governments that are still opposing them. So that's actually a pretty big shift for them. Now, I don't give them any credit. Let's be clear. I don't give them any credit at all. They're also using words like compassion, and so and then we're going to really go after the drug traffickers, but not the people using. And so this may from the outside look like it's really like kind of nothing and who cares. But let me just paint a picture here. So Canada's a political spectrum. So on the right, it used to be the Conservatives, but People's Party is even further right than them. So let's just stick with the big parties. So if the Conservatives move a little bit, I can't tell if I'm going right or left here, so bear with me. The Conservatives move a little bit on this side, it basically opens up a bit of political room for the Liberals, who I agree know exactly what they need to do. It's actually their party policy to have decriminalization of drugs, safe supply, much more than safe supply even exists now. And I got on record from multiple sources for my book research that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's reason for not decriminalizing drugs is because of the political pressure he faced for legalizing cannabis. And that's on the record, multiple sources. His office had an opportunity to correct that or to confront that. I'm a lawyer, I made sure I followed all the steps there, and they had no reply. Since that, I've heard from 2 federal cabinet ministers who sat at the cabinet table with Prime Minister Trudeau, senior people whose names you would all know, who told me the exact same thing. Okay, so make no mistake, this is just to confirm your worst suspicions, Gabor. It is absolutely about politics. So let's not move on from that too quick. So what we're saying is that it's more important to make a political decision that will benefit a governing party or leader rather than to make the right decision that you know is going to stem the loss of life. That's what we're talking, like, be very clear. That is what we are dealing with when we talk about the opioid crisis. And people say, why hasn't the government done more? It is because of politics. And this is where I just have to say, like, there is going to be accountability. Either or both, there's going to be political accountability, and there, public inquiry will at some point, I believe, be called into the opioid crisis. It may not be 5 years, it may be 10 years, but at some point there is going to be a reckoning and names are going to be named. And people who continue to support policies that are literally killing people, there is going to be a reckoning for them. And the other part is just morally. I mean, you are doing such harm. You need to quit your job. You need to resign and move on to something else. We can help you find a job. I'm talking about Premier Jason Kenney, Premier Doug Ford. These are people who have long before COVID opposed and shut down supervised consumption sites. And I didn't know what supervised consumption sites really were all about until I'd gone to one. And so people who haven't been there or are still kind of on the fence about this stuff, basically all it is if someone hits the floor from overdosing, there's a person there who administers naloxone, which is a temporary reversal of their overdose and provides them with oxygen if they need it, and possibly they're taken to hospital. That's literally it. The equivalent would be if you had a heart attack and someone came and used one of those public defibrillator mobile defibrillators on you. It's a first aid treatment. It works. End of story. So when you say you can't have a place for people to do that, they don't have a place like that. And if they're using alone, we know they're massively more likely to overdose.
By the way, what, the argument that I've heard, these people brought out that themselves. Why should we save them? But I thought, okay, well, that makes sense, and let's apply that right across medical practice. So next time a type A businessman works himself into a heart attack, and especially if he smokes and drinks on top of it, let's not defibrillate him. He shows up in the in the emergency ward with a myocardial infarction, kick him out. Next time somebody goes skiing at Whistler and goes down a steep slope, they know what the risks were. If they break their leg, why should we treat them? Why should we bring them back? So there's no logic to it. There's a heartless anti-logic is what's actually going on. And it's inconsistent.
Yeah, those are great examples. One of the things that I talk about at the end of Overdose is the research around that issue of stigma, right? And that's a word we throw around a lot, but it's a legal word too. And when I looked at sort of synonyms for that, because we don't use stigma in our everyday language, so it's a bit of kind of flies over my head, to be honest. I don't know that the public it resonates even when you say, oh, this is a high stigma. People have a lot of stigma. What it means is opprobrium basically it means contempt. That's what stigma means. Having contempt for people. You hate them for what they're doing. That's what stigma is about. And when they've done studies, not just in Canada, but around the world, the World Health Organization has done studies on stigma. And what they found is a group of countries, including Canada, about a dozen countries, when they ask people to kind of rank, the least to the most stigma, the people who they had the highest level of stigma about were people who use drugs. Even higher than people who have leprosy. And it's an international study, so they asked that. You would more quickly cross the street, or like the Good Samaritan parable, you would walk by someone who was lying there and not render assistance. That's the person who you're going to have contempt for. That's how serious this is. And it is absolutely, people are being blamed for using drugs. They're being blamed for dying from drugs. It is so devastating to look at that reality. And then why not look in the mirror? And as you begin to turn back the clock and look into the stories and the histories, like you do, Gabor, so much in all your work, really, and you find the roots and origins of these traumas. And I'm thinking now, especially of intergenerational traumas. And you look at what is the relative responsibility that we as individuals have, as communities, as societies have, as I'll say, as churches or other faith groups, as service organizations. What are the responsibilities we have towards redressing these underlying traumas? And in criminal law, the overarching principle that I have to teach my students is that in Canadian criminal law, what justifies punishing someone, there's two words: moral responsibility. That's the way that our law is framed, that you are morally responsible for your conduct. And as we begin to learn more about why people commit offenses, why they reoffend, what's really going on for them, I am convinced that the moral responsibility lies increasingly less and less with the individual who committed that one act at that one moment, and it rests much more substantially on all of us. And that's not to I learned in my own journey, there's a big difference between minimizing and justifying and excusing your own wrong behavior. There's a difference between that and accepting what you did, but understanding why you did it, right? And so, but the criminal justice system is all about still the retribution.
If the criminal justice system as much as looked at brain scans of people, you would see that the brain scans of really traumatized people are different. There's brain structures that don't develop the way they should. I'm talking about highly traumatized people now. They have less cerebral volume sometimes. Certain circuits just didn't develop. Brain chemicals didn't suffuse those circuits. The receptors for those chemicals are diminished. You can change people's brain by how you treat them. You can change people's brains, for example, by putting them into solitary confinement. That'll reduce the number of dopamine receptors in their brain. And then they come out and they act badly. Then they thrust back into solitary confinement because we've damaged their brains by what we've done to them. And so this question of moral responsibility, yeah, there's a moral responsibility, but on whose part?
So I think our first question, if you guys are ready, is from Casey, and pardon my pronunciation, Casey Hrinknow Skuchuk. Hi, Casey, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Hi there. First of all, I don't think it's just a case of saving lives. I think it's a case of societally developing an ability to value lives, all lives. But my question was about this is an elephant we have to eat, this problem. Can we take small bites of it and somehow succeed? Or does somebody have to, say we're going to cook the whole elephant and serve it to everybody? In other words, there are so many facets to this. It is a wicked problem. And can one organization or one government or one something take the whole thing, shake it and say, there, I've solved it? Or do we have to have a whole bunch of people who know what they're doing, attack it in their own ways and have that coordinated in some other way? Which might be the most successful? And if it has to be coordinated, who does that? And that's a question for both of you.
Yeah, did either one of you feel inspired to answer first, or?
I'll let Ben. I'll let Ben fail at it. I'll let Ben fail at it first, and then I'll get.
I want a few minutes to think about it too. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a great question. It's that's another reason actually why you know, the opioid crisis is persistent and worsened, because there is a lack of clear accountability. It's the levers and decision making and power is spread out through, you know, municipal, provincial, federal, indigenous governments. It's across criminal justice, healthcare, social work, education. We could go on and on. So I didn't even talk about policing yet, or, you know, this is very diffuse as a problem. Where I approached this in my book was to say, what are the stages in this as an emergency? So progressing through from it being an emergency to all the way through to thinking about preventing future people from becoming coming into problematic substance use and that sort of thing. So at the end of the book, there's a place where I combine all the recommendations that I took on and accumulated from all the people I talked to. And it starts out with the things that are essentially the most emergently needed, and we work up from there. So the first thing is getting people on board essentially with having naloxone widely available. There are still places in the United States where it is not widely available. And so if you're in a jurisdiction like that, that's your first fight, is allowing naloxone to be available without people providing their IDs, and it's something that they can access readily. Then you move up from there to talk about safe places for people to use. That's currently not a political battle in a province like BC, but it is in Alberta and Ontario and other places. So that's where they're at in this sort of stages of a policy response. Then you go from there and you go, okay, well, now people are using safely. What if we take, this is metaphorically, instead of them having contaminated street drugs, provide them with a safe supply so that they know what they're getting, what the potency and contents is? Are we okay with that? Most people, once you start to go down this code, that makes sense too. And then you go, and now remember, these are now people we're trying to keep alive. Let's provide them with some ability to access, you know, treatment if they want to go into treatment. What does that look like? Here's some medically based sound approaches. And then we're doing all this effort to help people who we know are, many of them, if not the vast majority, doing this because by definition, it's an addiction. They're if they wanted to stop, they just can't right away. You know, it's not something that's like a decision that's like for us choosing what to eat for breakfast. That's not the kind of decision. And so that's when we start talking about things like decriminalizing it and looking at the harms of criminalizing it. And then beyond that, we talk about things like a more holistic response and you know, broader societal changes and stuff. But in terms of the elephant, it is too big to take in one bite for sure. And so that is how I sort of approach this, as a sort of from a policy basis. I think it is a clear progression, by the way, as well, of more progressive policies, which you can begin to see different governments at different stages of, and it gives you an idea of kind of where do you go next. The last thing I would say in just 10 seconds is the Supreme Court of Canada could also decriminalize drugs overnight if they had a case before it. And they had an opportunity to do that in the Insight decision. They chose not to, for reasons that I think are now very clearly reversible. So in my view, just to be very clear, I've said this in the book, I don't believe that our current laws dealing with drug possession are constitutionally valid. I believe they infringe the charter. So there's that possibility too of a legal response to that particular question.
One follow-up is that's addiction. And I think there's a larger problem in the stigma around poverty and homelessness and mental illness, as well as addiction. And I wonder if we as a society can start to look at people as human beings rather than illnesses or addictions. Yeah,
and I completely agree with you on that. I I believe really strongly in, I do believe really strongly in education. I'm not willing to wait for kids to just, become adults too, but I do think plays a huge role. I was just this week in my son's grade 1 class and talking about people with disability. My son's severely disabled. He's already experienced bullying and teasing. Fortunately for him, he's not really aware that he's being bullied and teased. It hurts us more than him. And I recognized one of the kids in the classroom. He was a kid who's been one of the bullies. And knowing a bit of what I know now, I'm like, well, he's obviously got things going on for him too, right? And so I had some compassion for him. Before I would have seen him as a little bully. And so instead I saw him as a kid who just needed some, at this point needed some attention. And I didn't know his story. What was going on. But I saw those kids start to transform right in front of my eyes. And that was incredible. And so I think building that empathy, that compassion, that care, that's what does it. And I can tell you, all these kids have gone through the pink t-shirt. I won't bully, no one bullies. That's not making it work. I have to tell everyone that is, I don't want to say something that'll be in the front page of the paper without thinking it through, but some of these programs are like the Just Say No to Drugs campaign. Let me pick on that one. They're counterproductive. Mm-hmm. And we know that from the research. And so I agree with you. We're talking about heart level change. That's what it was for me. You notice I didn't say my story was, I went and read the 100 peer-reviewed articles about supervised consumption sites and I changed my mind. That's not anyone's story who goes through a transformation like this. It involves journeying and understanding, and as Gabor has can speak to it, his whole focus on that compassion inquiry approach, right? This is the kind of vision that he has championed, and it's something which I'm also really interested in learning more about. And
so I'll endorse everything you said, Ben, and insofar as it goes, but it only goes so far as particular drug policy is concerned. Whereas Casey points out, we're doing it with a much larger issue here as well. And it's a much bigger problem than simply the drug laws. It's actually, where does addiction come from? How does the system treat abused kids? How does the system intervene in families that are hurting their kids because they've been hurt? And on every level we fail. Social workers come into these homes, they take the kids away maybe, or they kind of punish the parents, but there's no coming alongside and say, what happened to you? And so this system doesn't understand trauma. So those of you that have seen the film, The Wisdom of Trauma, which Ben referred to it, and those of you that haven't, look it up. It'll be shown again in a couple of weeks online. But the important point I'm making is that we need to have a trauma-informed society. And that means that educators have to be trained in trauma. The bully that you talked about, I guarantee you is a traumatized kid. And if you actually look at, I was researching a book on bullying, which I never got to write just for lack of time, but the mental health outcome for the bully is as bad as it is for the victim of bullying. And so we have to have, as Casey is implying here, we need to have a much more compassionate approach, but not just compassion in the abstract emotional sense, but in a very practical sense, that social workers are deeply trained in trauma, that physicians are trained, that lawyers are trained, that educators are trained, that parents are given the support that they need. So to really tackle the issue of drug addiction, which is only a small sliver of the overall addiction problem in our society, by the way, a lot of debilitating addictions that have nothing to do with drugs, we'd have to have a totally different society. And look, the new book that you mentioned, Ross, the title's a bit different. It's been changed since you got that information. The title is going to be The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And what I'm actually saying is, this is a toxic culture. The way we are treating each other, the way we're set up to compete with each other and to see each other as potential enemies or threats to ourselves, the way we have been decommunalized, communities have fallen apart, the stress that families are under. It would take a much broader vision. So yes, in the meanwhile, let's get those supervised injection sites. Let's get those medications to people who need them, that are legal, or at least legally provided, so they don't have to go into the streets and take poison pills, which is what they're doing now, and they're dying of it. Let's do all that. But to deal with the larger issue, we need a larger vision of a society that runs along very different lines than ours does right now.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Our next question is from E. Mary Frances Macaulay. Welcome.
So I just wanted to thank everybody for their work. I am a widow of 8 children. I lost my husband to the opioid crisis. Sorry, I'm going to cry. I'm currently in school. I'm taking the addiction and community support program. But I'm really debating going into social work and extending my career. So I was wondering, where is the greater need for someone like me that's entering in the field? Where can I help the most?
Well, where would the program that you're taking now lead you to? Where would that be the outcome of that?
Right now it would be more addictions counseling and support that way.
And if you were a social worker, what would you see yourself doing?
I would honestly want to work in intervention and prevention with youth. And
I would just say that I would just say that both of those are great callings, and I don't think it's for us to tell you where you'd be most effective. It's what you bring to it that'll make you effective in either field. So it's whatever calls to you. You know, addiction counseling, boy, do we need good addiction counselors who understand trauma, because a lot of them don't. It's just about what are you using and how much are you using and all this kind of stuff. Boy, do we need good interventions in terms of prevention and working with youth. So it's just, I would just say to go with your heart, whatever calls you. That would be my advice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Frances. I had a question for you, Gabor, about compassionate inquiry. And I was watching an interview earlier today that you did for the Genius Network, where you talked about compassion and curiosity. And I wondered if you have some advice for people on just on a day-to-day level, if we have someone in our life that's dealing with trauma, dealing with addiction, how can we speak to them from that place of compassion and curiosity?
Well, simply by recognizing that whatever they're doing, they're being driven by something. There's a pain that's driving them. Whatever they're doing, there's a pain that's driving it. They didn't deliberately incur that pain. That pain was thrust upon them by life, and usually in childhood. So then instead of judging or even trying to change them, if we just get curious. So when I'm working with somebody who's addicted, I don't start talking about what's wrong with the addiction. I say, what's right about it? What's it doing for you? Oh, it's giving you peace of mind. It's giving you a temporary sense of warmth in your belly. It's making you feel more connected to people. It decreases your stress. It makes you feel more alive. These are the answers people get. That's what I mean by curiosity. And then you say, oh boy, I want those things too. We all want them. It's perfectly normal for you to want those things. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing abnormal about that. Problem is, the way you're going about it is not really getting it for you, is it? And so how did you lose it? How did you lose those qualities? How did you lose your peace of mind? Where did you get that pain from? In other words, just be curious about them and hear them. And there's a spiritual teacher whose books are, I bought many of his books from Banyan Books. As a matter of fact, if you look at the shelf behind me, which is behind my head there, there's a bookshelf. Your annual profit is sitting there on my bookshelf here. and there's a teacher called A.H. Almas, who I know you know, and I think you're going to have him with you this fall.
That's right. We'll be interviewing him in the fall, yeah.
Yeah, and he said once that only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to say the truth, to see the truth. So what Jesus brings to his followers and to anybody is compassion. And that's how people get to the truth. When they're no longer defending themselves because you're compassionate and you're actually curious about them and you want to get to know them, what it's really about for them, then they can open up to the truth within themselves. to go back to Jesus again, he said that the kingdom of God is within, but it's so covered over by all the stress and all the pain and all the worldly things. When we give people compassion, they can find the truth within themselves, but they need that compassion in order for that truth to be able to emerge. So that's where the compassionate curiosity comes in.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Jennifer Bibby.
I think I'm a retired nurse and I volunteer in Vancouver in the overdose prevention site. I have for 5 years. And when I heard the government was saying that we were going to have safe supply at the start of the pandemic, I naively thought, fantastic. I mean, all these people just need clean drugs, so they're not dying. But why did that not work out as well as I thought it would, and perhaps the Bonnie Henrys of the world thought it would work? Maybe that's the question. Gabor, I'm sure you know why.
Didn't work out.
Well, the people I work with, the people I supervise and reverse their overdoses, none of them have any access with the safe supply. And they some of them know about it, most of them haven't heard about it. It's just, there's a big disconnect, I guess, between the government saying that all physicians can prescribe whatever drug, and the folks in the downtown east side are just not accessing it.
Well, we don't have first of all, we don't have nearly enough physicians trained in it.
Right.
We probably don't have nearly enough physicians even wanting to go near it.
Right.
This has to do with the education of physicians, which, I mean, there are so many deficiencies in medical training, but if I had to pick the biggest one, it'd be, I'd have a lot to choose from, but the biggest one is in the realm of addiction.
Right.
The average medical student may not even hear a single lecture on addiction, and if they do, it's going to be in a very narrow biological sense. So that there's not the physician supply to prescribe these drugs. As a matter of fact, what needs to happen is it needs to be taken out of the hands of physicians. We need to get a lot more nurses involved who can just as easily and just as safely assess a person. We need to have geographically placed clinics. I mean, not everybody's going to travel from Surrey to the downtown east side.
Mm-hmm.
So these many municipalities resist these policies. And Ben was talking about this, that, there's the provincial level and the federal level, but then there's, there's all these different levels.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, there's a French-Canadian labor leader called Michel Chartrand, fiery guy back in the 60s. And he said, in his Quebecois accent, he said, the problem with having two gouvernements is that you never know who to kick in the ass, and it's the same, all these different jurisdictions, there's no coordination. So the principle is there, but we haven't built up the infrastructure to deliver the principles to the people who need it. That's what the problem is. And not enough thought and not enough care. Again, if you go back to the COVID situation, what if we put the same thought and care? Look how quickly they mobilized resources and they got everybody who wanted it, vaccinated, and how smoothly and beautifully and how compassionately it actually worked. It was a real pleasure for me to go to that vaccination site just for the human contact. But what if we envision providing that kind of care to the substance dependent population? We could do it, but it would take thought, care, commitment, and resources. We're not doing it.
Yeah, I can add a little bit on the stats if it's helpful. The BC Center for Disease Control has been tracking the rollout of some of this stuff, and one of the things that's really observable since if you compare from 2015 to 2021, okay, so that 6 year period, the number of opioid agonist therapy prescribers, like people who can prescribe these medications, has fairly steadily increased over that period from about 400 to just under 1,600. So it's quite a big jump over that period if you just track those numbers. the number of clients who are actually being provided with with the safe supply has not gone up nearly as quickly. And so in 2015, you're looking at around 15,000 OAT clients in the province of BC. And in 2021, we're under 24,000. That's very, very slow in terms of just comparing the rates. So while we've increased the number of people who are legally able to prescribe, the actual rollout has not been effective. And that's also, I'm just looking to, what we hear from advocacy groups of people who use drugs. We've got to, obviously, they need to be at the heart of these conversations. We see similar issues around things like Vancouver's proposal for decriminalizing drugs and the quantity of drugs that people would legally be allowed to have, and how many days of carries would they have, and all these sorts of things. So it sounded really good. At the start of the opioid crisis, you heard some really big things about changes to safe supply in BC, and people were saying, if one good thing, I remember hearing people say, I didn't say this one, if one good thing came out of COVID, it would be that we got safe supply. I remember people saying that a year and a half ago. I don't hear people saying that right now. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I think that the sense that you have is certainly backed up by the data, but you're the expert. And if I had known of your work, I would have probably tried to interview you for my book, Jennifer. So
I'm surprised you didn't come down to OPS. Yeah.
I did.
But what yeah, okay,
well, yeah.
I'm only there 1 day a week. I can't handle more than that. Yeah. But what upsets me is most of people think, and friends of mine, they know the work I do, and they say, oh, isn't it great that everyone's got safe supply? And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is what we hear in the media. And Bonnie Henry goes on about safe supply, and then she changed it. She made it even more, she added more drugs to that. And it's just like, okay, that's done. That's all fixed. Let's move on to the next problem, because everyone down there has got their safe supply. And it's just not the reality, unfortunately. Anyways, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much. And actually, the next person up is Russ Maynard, who I'm told works in the area of safe supply. So if Russ wants to sign on here, maybe he'll have something to add.
So actually, I just wanted to, I had an idea for a topic that I think speaks to the backgrounds of both the authors here. So I wanted to just introduce two lenses to consider in the public or political approach to drug use and the overdose crisis that you guys haven't really drilled into yet, but have touched on. And so if I could ask the two of you to speak to the role of poverty and the role of a person's civil rights. So I'm not going to choose who, but I'm sure Gabor is very comfortable to talk to the issue of poverty and this topic, because everybody, if you talk about the population of people that this topic is addressing, many aren't dealing with poverty, but poverty has a very visible aspect. It has a huge bias. And I would just introduce that in every single city on the planet Earth, if you go to every single city will have a low-income quarter. If you go to the low-income quarter of any city on Earth, you will have a higher correlation or a higher rate of substance abuse. And I'm just going to define that as somebody who is using substances, but would agree that I'm not able to use them in a manner that I feel isn't problematic in some respect, emotionally, in terms of my employment, in terms of my something like that. Because then there's a whole nother population that are using substances, a beer at night, a glass of wine with dinner, drugs at a rave, et cetera, where I don't have any addiction issues and I feel in control, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite a diverse topic. And so then this second part was the civil rights aspect, which I think captures a lot of what I just said. And I thought Benjamin might have a lot of opinions or a lens to look at through that. So if I'm an adult and choosing to imbibe, not with alcohol, which is a very powerful drug, a very problematic drug, a lot of carnage and cost in society that a lot of folks don't recognize, but has been studied to death, so to speak. So I'm imbibing not with alcohol, but with a drug, not causing anyone any harm. How are my civil rights impacted by the current social and legal landscape? And again, poverty may be the strongest correlation or leading indicator for substance abuse. And just to finish on the safe supply, it's important to consider that for many of the drug advocacy groups, they're advocating for the availability of substances that is analogous to marijuana, cigarettes, and alcohol. So regulated and controlled in terms of its quality, but available. The way we've been taught, or so far that safe supply has been discussed, and the way that safe supply is being discussed by Bonnie Henry's name has come up a lot, is firmly within the medical model. And it's that model that's causing the bottleneck that you've already touched on. So that's a lot to talk about. And I'm not saying talk about all of it. I just wanted to introduce some more subtleties into a really important conversation. And you've touched on why it's so important. And with that, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, Russ. I'll address the poverty question, and then I'm going to have to sign off because I have a family situation I have to deal with. So in terms of poverty, you're right that in the poverty-stricken areas of towns there's more drug use, but that's not a strict one-way correlation. It's also where can people afford to live who are living on drugs, you know, like an abject heroin-dependent individual with low education and no resources can't very well afford a home in Shaughnessy. So they're going to move to the downtown east side, where there's also a community of people that they can relate to. So it's not only that poverty creates the substance propensity, which it does, and I'll address that, but it's also that poorer areas draw people who are using simply for affordability of housing and a sense of community. But if you look at poverty as a risk factor, it is. Poverty is traumatizing.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the brains of people who grew up in poverty, it's not the same. And not because of, not strictly because lack of resources or lack of food, because in terms of absolute income, a poor person in Canada has a lot more than poor people are many other places in the world. But it's about what poverty means in a country where material wealth is considered the standard of success. So poverty itself brings a stigma, and we still have people who write articles about how people who are in poverty are that way because they're genetically inferior. So people who grow up in poverty, they have less educational opportunity. Parents are under a lot more stress. Stress on the parents translates into stress on the children. Stress on the parents translates into disturbed brain development on the part of children. Stress on the parent imposes coping mechanisms in the child that later translate into dysfunctional behaviors, which are then punished in the school system, which then magnifies the trauma. So when you look at the adverse childhood experiences studies, and I think Ben certainly refers to them in his book, you know, the sexual, physical, emotional abuse, death of a parent being jailed, a parent dying, violence in the family, neglect, a divorce. Poverty should be considered an adverse childhood experience as a risk factor. And we know that the more these risk factors accrue, the greater the risk of addiction later on. So poverty in a society that values success and demeans so-called failure is itself something that carries a stigma, and it carries shame. And the more shame there is, the more chance of addiction there is. So there's so many permutations here to the question that you raised, Russ. But the long and short of it is poverty is both a risk factor and a result of substance use on the part of people who don't have the resources to cope with the demands of society. That's what I'll have to finish, and I'll have to leave. Ben, it's been a real pleasure to work with you. Congrats on this book. I'm just so glad again that somebody from your background, I'm going to put it metaphorically, but actually got religion and is speaking the truth, and you'll be reaching an audience that some of us may not have access to. So I think that's a wonderful thing that you're doing, and I look forward to meeting you someday. And
It's very, very kind of you, very generous. I hope everything's okay, and we'll love to stay in touch. Thank you, Gabor.
And thank you, Banyan, as well. Thank you, Russ. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gabor.
Great. Well, I can take a minute on the civil liberties question, and then we're getting close to time. Yeah, I think for me, there's a lot in there. I actually just had a student do a specific thematic review of literature on criminalization of poverty more broadly, even than just on issues related to substance use. It's an issue I'm really concerned about. I keep hearing more about. The a couple of organizations who've written really good reports on this include the John Howard Society, BC Civil Liberties Association, Pivot. They've all done really good pieces on that. A couple of things that immediately come to mind in the context of the opioid crisis is there's, as you may know, there's research on people who are in precarious housing, homeless, that they're more likely to use and use quickly. And so because of the policing environment that they're in, that they don't have private place to use, they're more likely to do those things, which puts them at a higher risk of an overdose. And so there's a link there to the criminalization and policing piece. The other thing that came up again and again in interviews with advocacy groups for people who use drugs are, first of all, while there is a de facto form of decriminalization that's been in place in Vancouver for quite some time because of the Vancouver Police Department policy, and I put de facto in quotes, what we heard from multiple people was that what that means in practice is that some police officers will confiscate drugs they see and crush them underfoot or whatever, and that person then is going to have to go find them somewhere else, right? And so it's not at all doing any kind of public service or anything like that. And so you hear a lot about concerns about harassment and mistreatment of people who are poor by police. It's a heavily policed environment. The police presence in the downtown east side is incredible, and that's just the uniformed police presence. It is a very heavily policed area, and we know that the more you police an area, the more charges you're going to lay, and the more people are going to end up in jail. That's a fact. The other thing that comes up is around, what does the criminal justice system start doing with people in terms of their civil rights? Where can you go? Where are you allowed to go? Who are you allowed to be around? This is a phenomenon called red zoning. So if you are arrested for an offense, maybe it's a shoplifting offense or uttering a threat or possession, or you've got a large enough quantity that they try to say you're possessing with an intention to traffic the drugs, they will then impose conditions on you. And so the conditions that are very standard will be things like don't use, don't have in your possession drug paraphernalia, don't go within 500 meters or a kilometer or 2 kilometers of where you were last seen, committing your offense or whatnot. The problems with these things, which on their face you hear them, if you go, oh, that makes sense, the person shouldn't be committing these offenses again, so let's put those in place. What ends up happening with things like the red zoning is those in an area that's condensed, it has so many services and supports, is you're then no longer able to access those services and supports. You're essentially ostracized from your community. The problem with the not having drug paraphernalia is, if you read that very literally, which is how you have to read these conditions, does that include having a naloxone kit? Does that include having a clean syringe that public health has been spending over the years billions of dollars probably on harm reduction materials, and now those are going to be criminalized? So you've got this phenomenon of your criminal justice objective running completely against your public health measures, and they basically completely, cancel each other out. And then the ludicrousness, the complete insanity of putting a condition on someone who has a substance use disorder, of whatever it is, whether it's alcohol or heroin or fentanyl, whatever it is, telling them as a condition of your release, you can't use again. And if you do, you're committing an offense. And where the brunt falls disproportionately is on Indigenous people. The Correctional Investigators of Canada found that Indigenous offenders are more likely to end up back in prison, not for committing other crimes, but because of administrative breaches, things like we've been just talking about, things like breaching a no substance use condition. And it creates this cycle. We are setting people up for failure, and it sucks them into the criminal justice system, where the research shows, and this is probably a good point to wrap up with, the research shows that the prison environment reenacts essentially the same traumatic power dynamic that many of people who are incarcerated in Canada experienced as children being abused. Right.
Before I lose you, because I know this is but what about you, a professor or another professor, or the students in your class? Like, I would really love to put a plug in. I bought my copy at Banyen, so let's keep it in the family tonight. But Carl Hart, Carl with a C, Hart, H-A-R-T, has a new book out, Drug Use for Adults. And he's written other books. He's a leading American writer on these issues. But the book is mostly focused on that. What about the Ben Perrins of the world who choose to, instead of a glass of wine, imbibe something else? In his book, he talks about his own experience, and he likes to smoke heroin at home and with his wife, and he's a professor and all that kind of stuff. But that, I would just leave. I don't expect you to go into that, and maybe we're at the end of our time, but the people watching, the book talks about it's an untouched area in this conversation that I think is really interesting and timely at the 21st century, when so many other marginalized issues you've touched on, the sexual continuum, all kinds of issues of civil rights are now very much in the fore. And this one, what about if Ben Perrin decides to use MDMA with his wife in a responsible manner at home, and have a conversation and hang out around the fire in the backyard? Like, why is that illegal? And it's in itself a profound question.
Yeah, I think that the original justifications for drug prohibition is something that I looked at in my book, and they have their roots in, they don't have their roots in science, they have their roots in claims of morality and racism, right? That's what they're about. And so, yeah, for me, I think we already have that happening. Like, when you describe it as like, what if, like, that's already happening. And so, and it is technically illegal, but it's not what we see showing up in court cases. It's not what we see showing up in people in prison. And if they are ever charged, they're not going to jail. My chances of committing an identical offense, whether it's a drug offense or any other offense, you pick a simple assault offense in a bar fight, as a privileged white male law professor who would, if I had to, take out an equity line on my home if I got charged with anything, and could lawyer up and do very well and get great advice on how to minimize the risk there. That's going to be a totally different outcome than someone who does the exact same thing as me, who is racialized, who is poor, who uses substances, who doesn't have employment. This is why we talk about not only structural racism, but structural oppression, because the law formally treats us the same. There's no law which says you should go to jail longer because of not having a job, but that is how the risk analysis and factors play out throughout the whole process, from sentencing to parole decisions. And so, one of the topics that we're going to be covering in this course of mine in criminal law this year is on things like social determinants of crime. And there's really no teaching or understanding or awareness of those issues right now within the criminal justice system. It is a siloed, arcane system of law, and And increasingly, we see the problems with that. And so, yeah, I appreciate you raising that.
All right, thank you. That was exactly what I was trying to get at. So thank you. Thanks for the evening.
Thank you, Russ. Ben, Perrin, thank you so much. And I'd just like to take a moment to thank all the staff and volunteers for Word Vancouver for making this possible. There are a lot more events happening for Word Vancouver. You can check out the complete listings at the website, which is wordvancouver.ca. If you'd like to purchase a copy of any of the books we discussed today, including, of course, Ben Perrin's book, Overdose, Heartbreak and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis, you can do so at Banyan Books, www.banyan.com. That's BANYEN.com. Big thanks to our producer, Jacob, who makes all these amazing Banyan events possible, all this free content. Please support local independent bookstores, especially Banyan. By buying your books at Banyan, you support free events and programming like we have happening many days of the week. And of course, thanks to Dr. Gabor Maté, who had to leave early with a family issue. We wish him well and hope everything's okay there. And Ben, Perrin, thank you so much for taking the time and for the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate everyone coming today.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. And I'm your host, Ross McKeechee. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.